This video has been sponsored by Squarespace. A lot of people know the basic facts about Tolkien's life. They know that he fought in the First World War, and they know that his experiences in the war did somehow shape the books that he later wrote. But I'd argue that if there was one specific place where Tolkien's life experiences really shine through in his books, it would be in the aftermath. The Lord of the Rings does, overall, have a very happy ending, but Tolkien makes it explicitly clear that war extorts a heavy cost on everyone involved, both directly and indirectly. And even when the war is won and the battle's fought and done, there are some things that still linger. There are some people who can never go home. Frodo is one of those people who remained permanently altered by the experiences that he had in war, and Tolkien's nuanced, sensitive, and very sympathetic presentation of Frodo's trauma is one of the most important things in The Lord of the Rings. Just a warning that this video is going to be about some very heavy subjects, including mental illness, trauma, war, and death. So if those are particularly sensitive subjects for you, be sure to take care of yourself. And I also feel like I should let you in on a little secret, just between the two of us, and that is that this video has been sponsored by Squarespace. Squarespace is the all-in-one website building platform that's going to help you stand out and succeed online. And with Squarespace's cutting-edge design tools, anyone can build themselves a perfectly personalized website. Start with one of their professionally designed website templates or with their Blueprint AI website builder, and use their intuitive drag and drop technology to create a website that beautifully matches your brand and style. Your Squarespace site is going to be able to do everything you want it to do. You're going to be able to sell content, run email campaigns, and even collect donations directly from your website. With Squarespace's built-in donation tool, you can accept one-time or recurring contributions and keep your supporters engaged and connected while they support your cause. If you're interested in refreshing an existing brand or building a completely new one, Squarespace is the place to do it. Just go to squarespace.com for a completely free trial, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/JessOfTheShire to get 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Thanks so much to Squarespace for sponsoring this video and supporting the channel, and thanks to all of you for checking out my sponsors. Nowadays, shell shock is often brushed off as simply being the precursor to our modern comprehension of post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. And medically speaking, that's more or less true, but for the conversation that we're going to have today, we need to make a distinction between the two. Because as much as both shell shock and PTSD are very real and tangible mental disorders, they also exist and were originally conceived in a specific social and cultural context. And needless to say, the social and cultural context of the First World War is very different to the context of the latter half of the 20th century, where shell shock was conceived in the first half and PTSD was conceived in the second half. The term shell shock was first coined in 1915, and it was used to describe the many soldiers who returned from the front line with seemingly unexplainable and strange symptoms. The first officially recorded case of shell shock was a soldier who returned from the front lines, narrowly escaping death, only to wholeheartedly believe that he was blind. They checked him over, and medically there was no reason why his eyes shouldn't be working, but that soldier remained convinced he could not see. His symptoms worsened to include vomiting, amnesia, nightmares, an inability to smell, to hear, or to taste, and an inability to sleep, and an inability to walk. Physically, this soldier was fine, according to all available medical testing, but functionally he was disabled, and they just didn't know why. And so they diagnosed him with a term which was already in the popular conception, especially in the trenches. They diagnosed him with shell shock. Shell shock quickly became a fairly common diagnosis, and thousands of soldiers were brought in with more and more unexplainable symptoms. A private was found mute and deaf after recovering from shell explosions. He suffered for 6 months with this affliction until someone sitting by his bed and praying miraculously cured him. Anything from damaged senses to paralyzed legs, sweating, stammering, amnesia, nightmares, and more were all potential symptoms of this shell shock. One of the initially proposed theories was that shell shock was caused by constant low-grade physical damage. The noise, the barrage of shells, the constant physical impact caused some kind of tangible damage to your nervous system. And less charitable views proposed that shell shock was a result of cowardice, that's just what happened when you put weak-willed people in war. They reasoned that susceptibility to shell shock may even be genetically inheritable, that having an abusive or alcoholic father is the kind of thing that could predispose you to later on getting shell shock. And just as proposed causes varied, so did the treatments. One of the most popular treatments was to sit the soldier down, to tell them that there was nothing physically wrong with them, to let them rest for a few days, and then just to send them back to the front. Some doctors claimed to be able to cure shell shock completely in less than 24 hours, and they used a combination of peer pressure, nationalism, and sometimes electroshock therapy to get these results. They would tell a soldier that there was nothing wrong with them, and then if the soldier continued to exhibit symptoms, they'd electrocute them, and then they'd repeat that until they got the desired result. But if the treatment doesn't sound bad enough, being diagnosed with shell shock could also do permanent damage to your military career. In 1915, doctors associated with the war were ordered to put shell shock patients into 2 separate categories: those whose symptoms were caused by the result of enemy action, and those who were not. If it was arbitrarily deemed that your shell shock symptoms were a result of enemy action, you would be allowed your military pension. However, if they decided that somehow your shell shock symptoms were not a result of enemy action, that you came by them another way, you would not receive your military pension. For soldiers stumbling home, unemployed, terrified, and traumatized, a shell shock diagnosis could mean poverty for both them and their families. And all of that seems barbaric to our modern eyes, and frankly, it absolutely was. But I think that barbaric conception of early shell shock, along with the soldiers and civilians' experience with people experiencing shell shock, I think that was crucial to them helping to develop the modern conception, diagnosis, and treatment that we have for post-traumatic stress disorder today. Tolkien would have had no conception of the term PTSD in his time in the war, but he would have been intimately familiar with shell shock. Perhaps he knew it well enough that he could eschew the judgments and barbaric treatments of the disorder that were standard at the time, and could include in his writing a staggeringly modern portrayal, not of 1915 shell shock, but of quite modern post-traumatic stress disorder. And Frodo is the primary vessel through which this is represented. Post-traumatic stress disorder, as the name implies, is a condition brought on by a significant trauma. The particularities of this trauma are obviously quite diverse, but the DSM specifies that these traumas tend to include people that experienced actual or threatened death or serious injury, or people that watched death or serious injury occur to another person. And going by that criteria, Frodo has plenty of traumatic events to choose from. You could claim that his PTSD was brought on by the attack of the Barrow-wights, by his stabbing at Weathertop and the subsequent flight to the Ford, his run-in with the Watcher in the water, the loss of Gandalf, the betrayal of Boromir, his encounter with Shelob, his attack by Gollum, and so many more events. And on top of that, although it's less easy to categorize, I do think that the constant pull of the ring on Frodo's psyche does constitute a serious trauma in his case. The ring is impossible to accurately compare to any one real-life object, because it's a magical object. It is a malevolent will actively acting against the ring bearer, Frodo. The ring is as toxic as addiction, as harmful as a narcissistic abuser, and it becomes as precious to Frodo as a loved one. This means that he undergoes many different layers of trauma in his experience as a ring bearer. He both loves and hates this object so profoundly, and in the end, he is unable to destroy it. He is unable to destroy this thing that he hates so much, and I think that that does constitute a sort of trauma, this self-betrayal that he's experienced. But at the same time, you can also argue that Frodo destroying the ring and seeing this object that he came to find so precious be destroyed, that was also just as damaging to his psyche. And that whole mess, compounded upon the many other very direct life or death situations that Frodo witnessed and got into, it's really quite understandable that after all of this was over, the trauma would linger. As his story advances, before the ring is destroyed, we can already see the damage that this is doing to Frodo. As the ring begins to strain his consciousness more and more, he begins to dissociate, separating into two different versions of himself. Himself and the version of him that wants and needs the ring. When Sam takes the ring for safekeeping, thinking that Frodo is dead, Frodo wakes and snatches it back, seeing his best and most loyal friend as a thief. He panted, staring at Sam with eyes wide with fear and enmity. Then suddenly, clasping the ring in one clenched fist, he stood aghast. A mist seemed to clear from his eyes, and he passed a hand over his aching brow. "Oh, Sam," cried Frodo, "what have I said? What have I done? Forgive me." This kind of dissociation is something sometimes seen in cases of post-traumatic stress disorder. Frodo has had to split himself in order to resist the pull of the ring, and to hold on to some semblance of self. Much like Gollum, he has turned himself into two separate personalities. There is the ring bearer, who is possessive and cruel, and only becoming more monstrous by the day, and then there is still the hobbit that once left the Shire. He cannot consolidate these two versions of himself without risking destroying his pre-existing sense of self entirely. He might lose the person that he thought he was. Not every case of PTSD will involve dissociation, just as not every case of dissociation is linked to PTSD, but the two conditions are often seen together, and both of them are often triggered by extreme trauma. Frodo continues these instances of dissociation as they continue on their journey to Mordor, and by the time the pressure has reached its pinnacle, we see Frodo disappear completely for periods of time, the ring-bearer overwhelming and silencing the hobbit. As they near their goal, Frodo also finds himself wallowing in uncharacteristic despair. He can't even imagine what the future might look like, and he's forgetting the past, the entirety of his cognitive process absorbed by the fear, the pain, and the guilt that he's experiencing. He cannot recall the taste of the fine food of the Shire. He cannot remember the sound of the free wind or the feel of clean water. He has stopped believing that there's ever going to be a return journey. His trauma is overwhelming him so completely that by the end of the story, when Mount Doom is falling apart around them, he can't even bring himself to do those last few steps of running, of saving his own life. Sam has to go in there and carry him out of the mountain. This kind of hopeless and self-destructive speech and behavior is characteristic of someone who has experienced or is experiencing significant trauma. As he sits on Mount Doom, Frodo doesn't hope or plan. He can't even really celebrate that their long journey is over. Rather, he looks at Sam and tells him that this is the end. But against all odds, Frodo and Sam are saved, and that means that Frodo must continue to endure. Even though he just spent the last, year, the entirety of their journey, with Sting at his side, using that sword, when it comes to Aragorn's coronation, he refuses to wear any sword at all. He can't accept his role as the hero or the victor, perhaps because of guilt, or perhaps because for him, the journey is ongoing. He has not won, he has not become a hero, and he does not deserve to dress himself like a prince. His pain and his fear are still very tangible and very ongoing, and it seems that Arwen is the first person to recognize this. The Queen Arwen said, "A gift I will give you. If your hurts grieve you still, and the memory of your burden is heavy, then you may pass into the West, until all your wounds and weariness are healed. But wear this now in memory of Elfstone and Evenstar, with whom your life has now been woven." And she took a white gem like a star that lay upon her breast, hanging upon a silver chain, and she set the chain about Frodo's neck. "When the memory of the fear and the darkness troubles you," she said, "this will bring you aid." Arwen is offering Frodo a way out. She can see how much damage the world has done upon him, and she recognizes somehow that he may not be able to have these wounds healed on Earth, and passing on into Valinor may be the only way he has any hope of recovering. He takes the necklace as a reminder of Arwen's promise, and as a promise that the wounds that he is feeling need not be in pain forever. Although the mood is celebratory and the ending is happy, on the journey home, Frodo is quiet and unsettled. When prodded by Gandalf, he tells him, "It is my shoulder, the wound aches, and the memory of darkness is heavy on me. It was a year ago today." "Alas, there are some wounds that cannot be wholly cured," said Gandalf. "I fear it may be so with mine," said Frodo. "There is no real going back. Though I may come to the Shire, it will not seem the same, for I shall not be the same. I am wounded with knife, sting, and tooth, and a long burden. Where shall I find rest?" Gandalf did not answer. This conversation has so many layers to it. First of all, chronic pain, both physical and psychosomatic, is a common symptom of PTSD, especially if those wounds are associated with the trauma that caused the PTSD. Anniversary reactions, where the pain and the psychological symptoms grow worse around the year anniversary or just around reminders of the trauma, are also quite common. And then, of course, there's Frodo's quite damning statement that there is no real going back. He says, "Though I may come to the Shire," not "though I may come back to the Shire." He knows that either he, his home, or both of them have changed so much that although physically and literally he's going home, in his mind, he's incapable of ever coming home. What's even more striking is that the next day, after this conversation and after this anniversary pain, Frodo is back to normal. In fact, Tolkien notes that it's like he doesn't remember the previous day and what happened at all. Dissociative amnesia can come with PTSD, where after flashbacks or breakdowns, your mind helpfully forgets that you had that breakdown or that flashback because it's too painful of a place to go back into, and your mind is protecting itself. So you can be having a breakdown or experiencing a lot of pain one day, and then the next day, you won't remember it. When the hobbits do arrive home, it's a joyful affair. Merry claims that it feels like the whole journey they went on was a dream, and like he's finally waking up back at home. But for Frodo, he says that it's the opposite. He feels like now that he's back, he's falling back asleep. For Frodo, the journey has not ended, and it cannot end. His suffering is ongoing, just as real now as it was when it was literally happening to him. And now, returning back home to the peace and quiet of the Shire, it doesn't feel like waking up, it feels like slipping away into a dream, where you're trying to ignore all of the terrible things that are happening. Mentally, he is still and always will be bare before the wheel of fire, staring down death. During the scouring of the Shire, when the other hobbits take up arms to drive Saruman and his influence from their home, Frodo takes on a distinctly pacifist role. He refuses to take up a sword and play the sword-wielding, swashbuckling hero, even if it is to protect the home that he fought and suffered to save. Tolkien explains some of this response in a letter. It was not only nightmare memories of past horrors that affected him, but also unreasoning self-reproach. He saw himself and all that he had done as a broken failure. A large part of Frodo's ongoing troubles, and a very common facet of PTSD, is shame. While we are aware that Frodo's failure to destroy the ring is not really a failure, no one could have hoped to do better than him at that critical point, Frodo feels all of this guilt and failure laid onto his shoulders. As Bruce D. Leonard explains, believing total responsibility was his was a cognitive error not unusual with PTSD. Shame affects the sense of self. Shame helps emotionally define who or what we are not. Frodo is dissociating from who he was and who he believed he was. The foundations of his self-identity cracked beyond repair. And because of this very fundamental issue, this problem that he just can't let go of, recovery remains elusive, even when he is in complete safety and comfort back in the Shire. Even under Sam's loving care, he is bedridden by anniversary reactions, left weak and sick, clutching at Arwen's necklace, saying to himself, "It is gone forever, and now all is dark and empty." And he could be talking about many things there. It's never quite clarified. He could be talking about the ring and this kind of feeling of emptiness and despair that he has now that it's gone is such a double-pronged kind of pain. He's sad that the ring is gone, and he's also sad that he's still attached enough to the ring to feel sad that it is gone. But he also could be mourning the loss of himself, and the loss of all of his previous conceptions of who he was and what he was capable of. Either way, this kind of psychosomatic illness that Frodo experiences, especially in conjunction with the anniversaries of traumatic events, is very common for sufferers of post-traumatic stress disorder. And that is also joined with this continued selective amnesia, where he wakes up from these fits and acts like nothing was wrong, and like nothing happened at all. Slowly, Frodo begins to withdraw from the Hobbit community, from Shire life, and from his friends. Even Sam, who arguably would understand what he was going through the most, is put more and more at arm's length. Perhaps Sam and all of his friends that were with him on the journey are still a reminder of the worst of it, made all the more painful by the fact that they were healing and recovering in a way that Frodo was not capable of. Fortunately for Frodo, there is a possibility of a happy ending. Years later, when the pain hasn't faded and the burden has become too heavy, he is able to pass over the sea into Valinor, just as Arwen had promised. Sam is heartbroken by this loss, but Frodo explains, "Do not be too sad, Sam. You cannot always be torn in two. You will have to be one and whole for many years. You have so much to enjoy and to be and to do." Frodo sees in Sam what he himself will never be able to achieve. Although Frodo is permanently split in two, divided between who he was and who he now believes that he is, Sam is capable of healing. He is able to become one. As Frodo says, "It must often be so, Sam, when things are in danger. Someone has to give them up, lose them, so that others may keep them." So it is that Frodo sails on to paradise, where we can hope that someday his bone-deep wounds were healed, and Sam, Merry, and Pippin must go home and carry onwards. And one of the more subtle things that I think really makes this ending work is that not all of the hobbits were completely ruined by the experience that they had in the outside world. Tolkien allows the clouds to part for some glory, some joy to be brought about by this journey they went on. They became the people that they were meant to be because of the journey that they went on, and because of the terrible things that they experienced. Tolkien didn't write as if all war was entirely evil and pointless, because that would have been just as inaccurate as saying that all war is glorious and perfect. In the way that his characters responded to war and trauma, Tolkien was very careful not to make anything seem simplistic, because he knew that things that are simplistic are rarely actually true. And Tolkien was set on writing something that wasn't necessarily real, because it's fiction, but something that is true. Frodo is almost a textbook case for PTSD, which is really interesting considering that at the time when Tolkien was conceptualizing most of this story, that textbook had not yet been written. And I do think that the reason Tolkien was able to so comprehensively, sensitively, and honestly talk about these very complex issues is because they were very familiar to him. Tolkien spent about 4 months on the front, in the trenches, and he saw just about all of the horrors that war has to offer. By the end of the war in 1918, millions had died, and there was virtually no one who was left completely untouched by grief. At Tolkien's Oxford University, almost 1 in every 5 servicemen were killed, and all but one of Tolkien's closest friends had lost their lives. And not only had they died, Tolkien watched as war permanently altered the people that they were. More so than any previous wars in history, the soldiers of the First World War were educated. These were authors, poets, artists, philosophers, people that had dreamed of changing the world with the things that they made, only to find themselves 20 years old and lying dead in between the poppies, the strings of fate cut far too short. All war is tragic, and no lives are more important than others, but the soldiers of the First World War were able to capture the feeling of the loss they experienced in a profoundly new and terrible way. The loss, the pain, the fear, the animal horror of trench warfare. They captured this in their art that very often outlived them. And perhaps even more upsetting is the way that many of these men had their hopes and dreams and artistry drained completely out of them by what they had to go through. Tolkien remained in correspondence with his best friends, the members of the TCBS, throughout the war, and thus were able to track as these men with such lofty aspirations, men who thought that they were going to change the world together, slowly lost the will to live at all. Tolkien didn't just lose his friends to bullets and shrapnel. He lost them to a slow, spiritual decay, the seeping away of the hope that they'd once had in the human condition. Tolkien saw firsthand the terrible damage that war is capable of, beyond just the physical. The wisdom of the day may have called shell shock a symptom of cowardice, but Tolkien knew very well that shell shock and post-traumatic stress disorder and all of these terrible things were a symptom of war and the awful effect that it has on everyone. We can't say definitively that Tolkien had PTSD, he's been dead for about 50 years, nor can we say with any certainty that Frodo was definitely a self-insert character version of Tolkien himself. Tolkien actually went to great lengths to make it clear that The Lord of the Rings was not an allegorical reinterpretation of his experiences in the war. But by viewing this story through the lens of applicability, I think that we can see the way that Tolkien's own personal pain was filtered into the experiences of all of his characters. Not just the experiences of Frodo, but especially the experiences of those who weren't Frodo. One of Tolkien's best friends, Geoffrey Box Smith, who died in 1916, summed up his thoughts on war with this poem. What are we? What am I? Poor, rough creatures whose life is depressing and grey, is a heartbreaking strife with death and with shame and your polite laughter, till the world pass away in smoke and flame, and some of us die, and some live on after, to build it anew. The lot of those who were killed is terrible, but what about those who were left behind? Tolkien's generation is not called the lost generation for those that died, but for those who remained alive, left to pick up the pieces of a broken world. The thought of getting back to life as normal, after all they'd lost, after all they'd seen, after all that they had endured, seemed impossible, but there was nothing else that they could do. They had to get on with living, even if their hearts still were with those that were dead. Just like Sam, they had to continue to be one and whole for many years. whether or not that's something that they even wanted. But just because some of these people healed or continued onwards, that doesn't mean that they ever forgot. And especially as the Second World War reared its hideous head, many of Tolkien's peers and Tolkien himself found themselves completely demoralized. Tolkien wrote to his son, who was fighting in World War II, "One war is enough for any man. I hope you will be spared a second. Either the bitterness of youth or that of middle age is enough for a lifetime. Both is too much." He later describes the utterly stupid waste of war, lamenting the fact that he knew firsthand that in 30 years, when a new generation had come along, they would not have the memory of war. They would not remember what it cost, and in 100 or so years, we'd be right back to where we were back then. As he says, the burnt hand teaches most about fire. Tolkien had to watch as his own sons were fed into the war machine. His own son, Michael Tolkien, was discharged from service in the Second World War because of shell shock, and Tolkien had to try and hold himself and his family together as he watched the world fall apart for the second time in his too short lifetime. Something that's interesting is that it would have made for a much cleaner ending if Tolkien had killed Frodo, or if he had killed any of the other hobbits, so that the open wound of the grief of losing one of our main beloved characters would overshadow the very nebulous and complicated pain and decline that Frodo experiences. In fact, earlier drafts of the story don't include this slow decay. Frodo returns to the Shire a hero, and he helps fight Saruman off himself. But somewhere in the late 40s, a switch flipped, and we got the ending that we have today. One that shines a very special and uncomfortable spotlight on the true terror of war. Tolkien could have written a biography. He could have written a history book. He could have written war poems. He could have written a medical dissertation on the effect of shell shock on soldiers. But he didn't. Tolkien and many authors of his era, like William Golding, George Orwell, C.S. Lewis, all channeled their very heavy and complicated feelings about war into the craft of fiction, and most of them didn't even write war fiction. And I think that this is because of fantasy's effect of recovery. Fantasy and fiction act as a warped mirror, which somehow warps just perfectly to show us our real world clearer than we'll ever be able to actually see it. It's the same effect that eyeglasses have, where they warp the world in just the right way that your eyes can finally see it clearly. Fiction allows us to discuss very difficult, loaded, and heavy ideas with a kind of clarity that can be much more challenging in reality. In fiction, we can set aside what is strictly true. We can set aside particular political and social context. We can ignore the impossibility of a completely happy ending. We can dive deeper into the negative side of life, and in a way that really good fiction is uniquely capable of, we can explore perfect, wonderful solutions. The kind that reality just doesn't always accommodate for. PTSD is just one of many themes that Tolkien beautifully integrates into his story. These complicated ideas that you just can see so much clearer through the lens of fiction, through the lens of fantasy. A medical report on shell shock cases from 1915 doesn't nearly tell you as much about the real lived experience of soldiers dealing with shell shock that Tolkien is able to manage in his fantasy fiction. He communicates so much about war, about his personal life experiences, about his generation and his time, by specifically not talking about these things. And because he's talking about them in a generalized way and through the lens of fantasy, it means that these ideas can continue to be edifying and can continue to apply to many generations to come. Of course, we still need things like history and science, these disciplines that proclaim to try and get to the real truth, but the fact is that stories will always be a really great way of capturing what the human experience is truly like. The terrible, the beautiful, and all of the other uncapturable emotions in between. Now, I was only able to really discuss Frodo in this video and his specific case, but I think you could make arguments for characters like Faramir, Theoden, Éowyn. There are a lot of characters that experience the trauma of war in very different ways. And so let me know in the comments what you have to think about that. I feel like I should make a disclaimer that I'm not a psychologist. I have a theater degree, which arguably makes me the least qualified to actually talk about these things in an educational setting. So don't use this video to diagnose anyone with PTSD, because I did my best with my research, but please feel free to correct me. If I got anything wrong in the comments, I will be sure to pin that to correct myself. If you want some further reading about this stuff, this book, Tolkien and the Great War by John Garth, is the book to go to when it comes to Tolkien's experiences in the First World War. And this essay right here, which I need to read the title of, The Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder of Frodo Baggins by Bruce D. Leonard, is a really great source and a little bit shorter, specifically speaking about this subject. So look into those if you want more information, and for all of my sources, you can go right down into the description where I have those linked. Give this video a like if you enjoyed it and if you learned something new, and do consider subscribing if you want to tune in every week to hear me talk about stuff. Thank you so much for joining me this week, and I hope that you have a very happy, hobbity day.